The story begins with a man who had everything. He was a tycoon, a successful businessman whose name was known across cities and countries. People respected him, admired his intelligence, and even feared his power. His companies were growing, his wealth was beyond measure. And he lived in a grand mansion with hundreds of workers and staff at his service. To the world, he was untouchable, a man who had conquered life itself. But beyond the numbers in his bank account and the sparkle of his expensive suits, his heart belonged to only one person, his wife. She was not just his companion. She was his strength, his peace, and his happiness. Together, they looked perfect. Whenever they entered a room, people would whisper about their love, their bond, and how lucky they were to have each other. The tycoon, despite all his success, often said that the greatest fortune in his life was marrying her. She was kind, graceful, and full of warmth. Their love was the kind of love people dreamed about, the kind that made others believe in fairy tales. But life, as it often does, had a cruel twist waiting for them. One evening, as the couple returned home from an event, everything changed. The sound of laughter filled their car, but in just a few moments, it was replaced by the terrifying sound of screeching tires and shattering glass. The tycoon's car was hit, and the impact was brutal. He survived with minor injuries, but his beloved wife suffered the worst. She slipped into a deep coma that very night, her body alive but her soul silent, at the hospital. Doctors surrounded the tycoon with grim expressions. Their words pierced his heart like knives. They said her condition was critical, and the chances of her ever waking up were almost impossible. To them, she was just another patient with a tragic case. But to him, she was his entire world. He refused to believe their words. He held her hand, kissed her forehead, and whispered that she would come back to him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months. The tycoon spent endless nights by her bedside, watching the monitors beep, waiting for her eyes to open, waiting for her voice to call his name. His empire no longer mattered. Meetings were ignored, deals were canceled, and profits were left unattended. All that mattered to him was the woman lying motionless on the hospital bed. Eventually, he brought her home, turning a part of his mansion into a private hospital room. He hired the best doctors, the most skilled nurses, and bought machines from around the world. Money was no object. If there was even a 1% chance of her waking up, he was determined to give her that chance. Every day he sat beside her, reading her favorite books, playing the songs she loved, and telling her about his day as if she could hear him. His voice often broke, but he never stopped. To him, she was not gone, she was just silent, waiting for the right moment to return. But the pain of watching her like that was unbearable. People around him began to lose hope. Friends and relatives advised him to move on, to accept reality, and to understand that she was never coming back. But how could he? The woman who had once smiled at him with such love, who had stood by him during his darkest days, who had given him everything, how could he give up on her now? As years passed, the mansion grew quieter. The laughter and joy that once filled the halls disappeared. He no longer hosted parties or gatherings. The once bustling home became a place of silence and sorrow. He lived like a shadow of the man he once was, consumed by grief but still holding on to hope. His eyes aged faster than his body, and though his businesses continued to thrive, his soul felt empty without her. Every night, he would sit by her bed and whisper promises. He told her about the stars outside, about the rain tapping the windows, and about how much he missed her voice. Sometimes he imagined she moved. Sometimes he believed her fingers twitched. But the doctors always dismissed it as nothing more than reflexes. Still, he refused to stop believing. What hurt him most was the memory of the accident. The sound of that crash echoed in his mind every day. He blamed himself for not being able to protect her, for not being fast enough to stop what happened. Guilt and love mixed inside him, tearing him apart, but also giving him the strength to keep going. And so, year after year, the Tycoon's tragedy continued. He had all the riches of the world, but they meant nothing without her smile. His wife, once the light of his life, now lay in darkness, silent and still. The world admired his success, but only he knew the truth. He was the richest man on paper, but the poorest man in spirit. Asterisk, when the first year passed with no sign of improvement, the mansion felt different. The Tycoon's house, once alive with music, laughter, and the buzz of important guests, slowly became a place of quiet footsteps and hushed whispers. Doctors came and went, nurses rotated in shifts, but the one person who never left her side was the Tycoon himself. He had built an empire with patience and strategy. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this kind of waiting, the waiting that had no promise of an end. Every morning, he would walk into her room with hope stitched across his face. He would greet her like he always had, as if she would suddenly open her eyes and reply. "Good morning, my love," he would whisper softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. He refused to let her condition erase the rituals of their love. Even when the nurses told him it wasn't necessary, he still brought her flowers, her favorites. White lily, placed them by her bedside. To him, she wasn't a patient. She was still his wife. Years drifted by like silent shadows. The world outside changed rapidly. Businesses grew, technology advanced, even the city skyline looked different. But inside that room, time stood still. The Tycoon lived in two worlds, one filled with deadlines, contracts, and meetings, and another where silence wrapped around the sound of machines beeping steadily. The second world was the one he cared about most. People around him had stopped asking questions. In the early years, relatives visited, offering prayers and words of comfort. Friends from high society came, some out of genuine concern, others out of curiosity. But as the years stretched into a decade, their visits grew fewer. Eventually, only the nurses and doctors remained. Along with the Tycoon, who never once thought of giving up, his hair turned silver. His face grew lined, but his love remained young. Each wrinkle on his forehead was a map of his endless nights spent awake, staring at her, hoping for the smallest sign. He grew used to disappointment, but never numb to it. Every twitch, every flicker, every tiny movement gave him a reason to believe again. The hardest part was the loneliness. For 20 years, he carried a silence inside him that no one could truly understand. At parties, people admired his success. At business conferences, they clapped at his speeches. But when he returned home, he sat beside her bed and spoke into the void. He told her things he never told anyone else, his fears, his regrets, his dreams. Some nights, he cried silently, gripping her hand as though his touch could pull her back to him. The staff at the mansion often wondered how he kept going. Most men with his wealth would have remarried, moved on, or hidden their pain behind luxuries. But not him. His loyalty became legendary. Newspapers sometimes wrote about his devotion, calling it tragic love. Strangers admired his faith, yet none of them saw the daily suffering that came with it. As the 20th year approached, his hope had begun to mix with sorrow. He was a strong man in the world's eyes, but in private, he often questioned destiny. Why her? Why this? Why a punishment so cruel to the kindest soul he had ever known? Still, even as questions burned inside him, he never let go of her hand. On her birthday every year, he threw a small celebration in her room. Just him, the nurses, and her. He would bring a cake, place candles on it, and sing softly. Sometimes his voice cracked, sometimes tears blurred his vision, but he never skipped a single birthday. He believed she could hear him somewhere deep inside her silence. 2 decades is a lifetime. Children grew up, businesses rose and fell. Generations changed, but for him, time remained frozen in the moment of the accident. His love was chained to her, and he refused to break free. The mansion's corridors had grown used to the sound of silence, and so had he. Yet, inside that silence lived his greatest tragedy and his greatest love. What no one knew was that destiny had been quietly preparing something unusual, something that would change everything. For 20 years, silence ruled the mansion. But in the quiet corners where no one paid attention, a new character was about to step into the story, someone who would carry the spark of life back into that lifeless room. After 2 long decades of silence, the mansion felt like a monument of grief. Every wall, every corridor carried the weight of sadness. The Tycoon had grown older, and though his businesses still stood strong, his home felt lifeless. Many servants had left over the years, unable to bear the heavy atmosphere of the place. Only a few loyal staff remained, working more out of loyalty than duty. But life has a way of bringing new beginnings when they are least expected. One morning, the Tycoon's manager informed him that a new maid had been hired. She was a widow who had lived through her own struggles, and she had come with her young son, a boy of hardly 12 years old. The boy's eyes carried a spark, bright, curious, and unafraid of the silence that wrapped the mansion. When they arrived, the staff whispered among themselves. The woman was humble, dressed simply, her hands rough from years of labor. Her son clung to her side but looked around with wide eyes, fascinated by the grandeur of the estate. To him, the marble floors, the chandeliers, and the vast gardens were like something out of a storybook. He was not frightened by the silence. Instead, he was curious. The Tycoon barely noticed them at first. For him, new staff came and went. His focus never shifted from the room where his wife lay. But the boy, unlike others, was not drawn to the riches of the house. He was drawn to the quiet room that everyone else avoided. Nurses moved in and out of it like shadows, always serious, always careful. But when the boy peeked inside, he saw not just a patient connected to machines, he saw a sleeping woman who looked peaceful, as if waiting for someone to talk to her in the first few days. He followed his mother around quietly as she worked. But whenever he had a chance, he slipped into that room, standing silently by her side. Sometimes he whispered a hello, sometimes he only stared, wondering how someone could sleep for so long. He wasn't afraid. In his innocence, he believed she could hear him. The nurses scolded him at first. They told him it was not a place for children, that he might disturb the patient. But the boy was gentle, never noisy, never rough. He only wanted to sit near her and talk softly. His presence was unusual, yet oddly comforting. The room that had felt heavy for years seemed lighter when he was inside. The maid, his mother, noticed this too. She worried at first, afraid the Tycoon would be angry if he discovered her son wandering into such a private place. But when she tried to stop him, the boy simply said, "She looks lonely. Maybe she wants someone to talk to." The simplicity of his words touched her heart. Eventually, the Tycoon noticed the boy. One evening, when he walked into the room, he found him sitting by his wife's bed, reading from a small, torn book. It was a children's story, one filled with heroes and magical lands. The boy was reading with so much energy, as though the woman could hear every word. At first, the Tycoon frowned. He wanted to send the child away. But then he saw something different in the boy's ease, a kind of belief he himself had lost long ago. For 20 years, people had looked at his wife with pity or resignation. Doctors gave statistics, nurses gave medical updates, relatives gave shallow sympathy. But this boy looked at her with hope, not pity. That small difference unsettled the Tycoon, but it also planted a seed inside him. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's visits became routine. He would sing songs, tell stories, and even joke as if she could laugh with him. Sometimes he held her hand gently, as if trying to pass his own warmth into her. Nurses, once doubtful, began to smile quietly when they saw him. The boy's innocence brought something no amount of wealth or medicine had been able to bring. Light. The tycoon didn't admit it out loud, but he began to wait for the boy's visits. He started arriving at the room at the same time, watching silently as the child spoke with his wife. There was something pure in those moments, something even his millions of dollars could not buy. The mansion, for the first time in years, felt like it was breathing again. The staff noticed it. The air seemed lighter, the halls less heavy. The boy, without even realizing it, was changing the rhythm of the house. His laughter echoed in places that had long been quiet, and his innocent faith began to seep into hearts that had long been cold. The tycoon didn't know it yet, but this boy was not just a child wandering into a forbidden room. He was carrying something far greater, the spark that would one day break 20 years of silence. The boy's presence in the mansion soon became impossible to ignore. While the staff moved around with the seriousness of duty, the boy moved freely, as though the walls did not frighten him and the silence did not weigh him down. He was not like other children. Most would have grown restless, bored, or even scared in such a place. But he seemed to carry with him an invisible light, a warmth that clung to every corner he entered. At first, his visits to the tycoon's wife's room were small adventures. He would peek in cautiously, tiptoe near her bed, and whisper short greetings. "Hello," he would say, as if testing whether she could hear him. When nothing happened, he didn't give up. Instead, he returned again the next day and the day after that. His patience was unusual for a child. He acted as though he understood that some things in life needed time. Soon, these short greetings turned into conversations. He would sit on the edge of the chair beside her bed and talk about everything what he saw in the gardens, what games he wanted to play, what he wished he could eat for dinner. Sometimes he told her funny little stories, and other times he admitted his fears. "I get scared of the dark sometimes," he whispered one night. "But I think you're braver than me because you've been sleeping in darkness for so long." The nurses began to notice. They had spent years tending to her, adjusting machines, checking vitals, cleaning her skin. But they had never thought to speak to her like that. To them, she was silent, unreachable. But to the boy, she was simply quiet, not gone. He believed she was listening. His mother scolded him gently at times, worried that he was bothering the lady or overstepping boundaries. But he always replied, "She needs someone to talk to. Maybe her heart is tired of silence." The tycoon, too, began to observe these little moments from the shadows. He had never invited the boy to sit there, never asked him to speak to his wife. Yet, each time he watched, something stirred in him. For 20 years, he had spoken to her too, but always with a heavy heart. His words were weighed down by grief and desperation. But the boy spoke with life, with laughter, with hope. He didn't see her as broken. He saw her as someone waiting to return. What touched the tycoon most was the boy's tenderness. He treated her with a gentleness far beyond his age. He would take her hand, tiny in his, and rub it softly as though trying to warm her back to life. He hummed songs his mother had taught him, simple lullabies with no grand meaning but filled with sincerity. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he leaned close to her ear and whispered, "Please wake up. He misses you." I can see it in his eyes. The staff, once skeptical, slowly began to feel something different in the air. It was as if the boy's words carried weight, as if they slipped into the silence and shook something deep inside the sleeping woman. A nurse swore she saw her fingers twitch one day while he sang. Another claimed she noticed her breathing grow steadier when he spoke. The doctors brushed it off as coincidence, but the boy didn't. He smiled, certain that she was listening. The bond between the boy and the woman deepened in ways no one could explain. He didn't see her as just the tycoon's wife lying in bed. He saw her as a friend. A silent friend, yes, but still a friend. He shared secrets with her, confessions he told no one else. Sometimes he admitted once, "I wish my father was still alive. But maybe if he were here, I wouldn't have met you." His words hung in the air, innocent yet profound. The tycoon, overhearing that, felt his chest tighten. He realized the boy wasn't just filling the silence, he was healing it, not only for his wife, but for him too. For the first time in years, the tycoon felt hope that did not come from doctors or machines, but from the soft voice of a child who refused to see impossibility. And so, day after day, the boy came. He told her jokes, sang her songs, and shared his world. A strange and beautiful bond grew between them, one of faith, of love, of unshakable belief. No one else could understand it. But perhaps it didn't need to be understood. Perhaps it only needed to exist. What no one could deny was this: the boy had reached her in a way no medicine ever could. His bond was invisible, yet it was strong. Strong enough to bend destiny. Strong enough to stir something inside a woman lost in silence for 20 long years. The mansion had grown used to silence. For 20 years. The steady hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes were the only sounds in the tycoon's wife's room. But slowly, almost secretly, that silence began to change. It started in small ways, so small that most people didn't even notice. But the boy did. One afternoon, as he sat by her side, reading one of his favorite stories, he saw something that made his heart race. Her fingers, usually still and pale, twitched ever so slightly. At first, he thought he had imagined it. But then, as he continued reading, he saw it again. The boy gasped and looked up at the nurse. "She moved," he whispered excitedly. The nurse shook her head, her face tired with years of routine. "It's just a reflex," she said softly. It happened sometimes, but the boy didn't believe it was just a reflex. His eyes were too bright, his hope too alive. "No," he said firmly. "She's listening." From that day, he paid closer attention. He watched every breath, every flicker of her eyelashes, every faint movement. To others, it was nothing. To him, it was everything. The tycoon, who had long buried his heart under layers of disappointment, began to notice it too. At first, he was afraid to believe. Hope had hurt him too many times before. But as the boy insisted, as he pointed out every twitch and every change, the tycoon started to wonder what if he was right. What if she was trying to come back? Nights grew different after that. The boy continued his routines, singing, talking, telling stories, but now there was a new energy in the room. It was as if his voice was pulling her closer to the surface of life. Sometimes when he sang, her breathing changed rhythm, slower, deeper, as though she were following the melody. Other times when he laughed, the corners of her lips seemed to tremble faintly, almost like the ghost of a smile. The doctors still dismissed it. "It's the body's way of responding to stimuli," they explained, writing notes without emotion. But the boy didn't listen to their scientific words. He believed in something greater. He told the tycoon one night, "She's tired, but she's fighting. I can feel it." The tycoon looked at the boy, searching his face. In the child's eyes, he saw something he had not seen in a very long time: faith. Not the heavy faith of a broken man, but the innocent, unshakable belief of a child who still trusted miracles. That belief began to infect the tycoon's heart. Slowly, carefully, he allowed himself to hope again. One evening, a storm rolled over the city. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder shook the walls, and lightning lit the sky in blinding flashes. The boy sat beside her bed, unafraid, holding her hand as he always did. "Don't worry," he whispered. "Storms are loud, but they always pass." He hummed a lullaby to calm her, his voice trembling but steady. As the thunder roared, the tycoon swore he saw her eyelids flutter. His heart nearly stopped. "Did you see that?" The boy exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. She's trying. She's trying to open her eyes. The tycoon grabbed his wife's hand, tears filling his tired eyes. For the first time in 20 years, he felt as if she were closer to him than ever before. From then on, every small change was treasured. A tear that slipped from her eye during one of the boy's songs. A faint sound that could have been a sigh. A hand that seemed to press back ever so slightly when the boy squeezed it. None of it could be explained by science, but all of it could be explained by love. The boy grew more determined. He began to treat her like she was awake, even if the world said otherwise. He asked her questions, waited for her answers in silence, and then smiled as though he had heard them. He told her stories of the garden, of the birds that perched on the balcony, of the way the sun lit the mansion's marble halls in gold. He filled her silent world with colors, with laughter, with life. The tycoon watched in awe. For 2 decades, he had tried everything money could buy. But this child, this ordinary boy with nothing but a pure heart, was succeeding where all the wealth in the world had failed. His wife was stirring. She was waking, little by little, as though the boy's voice was calling her back from the edge of forever. The staff whispered among themselves. Some still doubted, others began to believe. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The air that once carried only sorrow now carried anticipation. Something was happening, something extraordinary, and though the world outside remained unaware, inside that room, history was quietly being written. The boy, the maid's son, was doing the impossible. He was breaking 20 years of silence. One word, one song, one touch at a time. The night it happened was like any other, yet it would be remembered forever. The tycoon sat in his usual chair, his face lined with years of waiting. His wife lay still, as she had for 2 decades, while the machines hummed steadily, filling the silence with their mechanical rhythm. The boy was there too, sitting cross-legged beside her, humming softly as he stroked her hand. He had made it his habit to talk to her about everything: school lessons, the weather, even silly jokes that made him laugh at himself. That night, however, he seemed unusually serious. After a long pause, he looked at her pale face and whispered, "I know you're tired. I know it hurts. But please, wake up. He misses you too much." He may not say it, but I see it in his eyes every day. The tycoon looked up at the boy, startled. The child's voice was steady but carried a depth beyond his years. Then, as if words weren't enough, the boy began to sing. It was a lullaby. One his mother used to hum when he was afraid at night. His voice was soft, shaky at first, but then it grew clearer, sweeter. Like a ray of light piercing through a storm. The tycoon closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over the room. He had heard countless songs, brought choirs to sing in hope that music might reach her, but none of them carried the purity of this boy's voice. It wasn't polished. It wasn't professional. It was real. It was filled with something no training could create in Nisan faith. And then, happened. At first, it was so small that the tycoon thought his weary mind was tricking him. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, sliding slowly down her cheek. His breath caught. He stood abruptly, his heart pounding like a drum. "Did you see that?" He whispered hoarsely, staring at the boy. The boy, still holding her hand, nodded eagerly. "She heard me," he said firmly. "She's crying because she heard me." The tycoon leaned closer, his hands trembling. "My love, if you can hear me, give me another sign, please." The boy tightened his grip and continued singing, his voice breaking slightly, but never stopping. He sang with all the strength his small heart had, as if his words alone could pull her back from the depths. And then, as if responding to his call, her eyelids fluttered. Just once, then again, the tycoon staggered backward, tears flooding his eyes. For 20 years he had prayed for this moment, dreamed of it, begged for it. And now, before his very eyes, it was happening. "Keep singing." He cried desperately to the boy. "Don't stop." The boy obeyed. He sang louder now, his face lit with determination. He pressed her hand gently, whispering between verses, "You can do it. You're strong. Come back." The woman's lips trembled. Her fingers curled faintly around the boy's hand. Machines beeped faster as her body reacted, as though life itself was flowing back into her veins. The nurses rushed in, alarms sounding, but no one could believe what they were seeing. For years, her body had remained unresponsive. But now she was fighting, her chest heaving, her eyes fluttering, her fingers gripping tighter. The Tycoon dropped to his knees beside her, clutching her other hand. "It's me, my love. I'm here. I've always been here. Please, come back to me." His voice cracked with desperation, but for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't speaking into emptiness. He was speaking to her. And then, in one miraculous moment, her eyes opened. The room froze. Time itself seemed to stop. Her gaze was unfocused at first, clouded by years of darkness, but slowly it sharpened. She blinked, looked at the boy, then at her husband. Tears spilled from her eyes as her lips parted to form a single raspy whisper. "You waited." The Tycoon sobbed openly, pulling her hand to his face, kissing it over and over. "Yes," he cried. "I waited. I would have waited 100 lifetimes for you." The boy, overwhelmed but smiling, squeezed her hand. "I told you she could hear us," he said quietly. His voice trembling with joy. In that instant, the impossible had been done. Not by doctors, not by machines, not by the endless wealth of the Tycoon, but by the unwavering belief of a child who refused to give up on someone. Others had already forgotten. The staff, stunned into silence, began to weep too. Some had served the Tycoon's wife for years, believing they would never see her eyes open again. And yet here she was, alive, awake, and breathing words after 20 long years. The boy had done what no one else could. With his innocence, his voice, and his pure heart, he had pulled her back from the edge of eternity. The Tycoon turned to him, his vision blurred with tears. He reached out and held the boy's shoulders firmly. "You," he whispered, "you are the miracle we prayed for." And as the storm outside cleared, leaving the sky washed fresh and new, the mansion that had been silent for 2 decades filled with the sound of life again. Asterisk, news of her awakening spread through the mansion like wildfire. The staff who had once walked with heavy steps now rushed through the halls with shining eyes. Nurses who had grown numb to routine wept openly, holding one another as though they too had been given a second life. For 20 years, they had cared for her body, adjusting machines and changing bandages, never truly believing they would witness this moment. But now, the impossible was standing before them. The Tycoon refused to leave her side. He sat by her bed, clutching her hand as though afraid that letting go would send her back into darkness. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears, but his heart was full for the first time in decades. Every so often, he whispered, "I love you. I'm here. You're safe." And she, weak but awake, tried to answer with faint nods and whispers of her own. The boy was there too, sitting quietly in the corner of the room. For him, it was not a miracle born out of surprise, it was simply the result of belief. He had always known she would wake up. He had always trusted that his voice, his words, and his love would reach her. Yet seeing her eyes open, hearing her whisper, filled him with joy so overwhelming that he couldn't stop smiling. The doctors arrived in a rush, their coats fluttering like wings as they hurried to her side. They checked her vitals, asked her questions, tested her responses. Their faces, usually calm and professional, now carried expressions of shock. One of them muttered almost to himself, "This is medically impossible." After 20 years, Another shook his head, unable to hide his awe. They wanted to call it science, but deep inside, they knew it was something else, something far beyond their explanations. Reporters caught wind of the story soon after. The Tycoon had tried to shield his private life from the public for years, but some miracles could not be hidden. Within days, the world knew. The wife of a wealthy tycoon, who had been in a coma for 20 years, had opened her eyes again. Headlines called it the miracle awakening and the return of the sleeping lady. But the media, hungry for drama, focused on the boy. They called him the child healer, the boy with the golden voice and the miracle maker. For while money had bought machines, and doctors had offered medicine, it was the boy's innocent faith that had stirred her soul. Cameras flashed as journalists tried to interview him, but he remained shy, clinging to his mother. He never claimed credit. When asked how he did it, he answered simply, "I just talked to her." And she listened. The Tycoon, however, made sure the world knew the truth. At a press conference, his voice broke as he spoke. "I spent millions on treatments. I hired the best doctors. I prayed every night. But it was not me who brought her back. It was him, the maid's son. His voice, his love, his belief. They gave my wife the strength to return." The room fell silent. For once, people saw the Tycoon not as a man of wealth, but as a man humbled by love and gratitude. His words carried more weight than gold, for they came from a heart that had known 20 years of suffering. Inside the mansion, life changed completely. Her room, once a place of sorrow, became a place of laughter and joy. The boy continued to visit her every day, and now she could listen, smile faintly, even squeeze his hand in return. She grew stronger with each passing week, her voice returning slowly, her eyes brighter each time she looked at her husband. The bond between her and the boy became a story of its own. She adored him as if he were her own child, and he adored her as if she were family. Sometimes she would whisper, "You saved me," and he would shake his head and reply, "No, you saved yourself. I just reminded you how to try." For the Tycoon, this recognition was more than public praise or headlines. It was the moment his faith was reborn. He realized that miracles were not bought with money, nor commanded with power. They were gifted by love, by innocence, by the unexpected touch of a pure heart. The world watched in awe. But inside the mansion, the miracle was not about fame or recognition. It was about a man who got his wife back, a woman who returned to the world after 2 decades of silence, and a boy who taught them both the true meaning of hope and though the world called it the miracle awakening. Those inside the mansion knew the truth. It was not just a miracle. It was love in its simplest, purest form that had turned the impossible into reality. The mansion, once a house of sorrow, slowly began to breathe again. For 20 years, its walls had echoed only with silence and despair. But now they carried laughter, gentle conversation, and the soft sound of life returning. Where there had been darkness, light now poured in. Where there had been grief, joy began to bloom. The Tycoon's wife, though weak, was alive, and each day she grew stronger. At first, she could only whisper a few words, her voice fragile like the wings of a butterfly. But with every passing week, her strength returned. The nurses guided her through small movements, lifting a hand, turning her head, eventually taking her first steps after years of stillness. Each tiny achievement was celebrated like a victory, filling the mansion with cheers and tears of joy. The Tycoon never left her side. He had waited 20 long years for this, and now he devoted himself entirely to her recovery. Gone was the man burdened with sorrow. In his place was a husband reborn, grateful for every smile, every touch, every breath she took. At night, he would sit beside her bed, not in silence as before, but holding her hand and telling her how much he loved her, how he never stopped waiting. How every day of those 2 decades had been worth it for this moment. And always, by her side, was the boy. The maid's son, who had once been overlooked and underestimated, had now become the heart of the household. His bond with her deepened even further. She looked at him not with the eyes of someone merely grateful, but with the tenderness of a mother. She often said, "You gave me back my life." And though he blushed and denied it, everyone knew her words were true. The Tycoon, too, felt differently toward the boy. In his eyes, the child was no longer just the maid's son. He was a miracle worker, a gift sent by fate. He began to mentor the boy, teaching him about business, about the world, about life. More importantly, he treated him with respect, often introducing him to guests as the boy who saved my family. The mansion staff, who once whispered out of pity, now spoke with pride. They told visitors about the miracle, about how a child's pure heart had succeeded where wealth and power had failed. Slowly, the mansion became not just a place of sorrow healed, but a symbol of hope. People from across the city sent letters, flowers, and prayers. Some came to the gates simply to catch a glimpse of the boy or to share their own stories of hope and healing. But inside those walls, fame didn't matter. What mattered was family. The Tycoon's wife found joy in small things, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of birds in the garden, the laughter of the boy who sat beside her each afternoon. For her, every moment was a gift. She had lost 20 years of her life, but she was determined to make every new day meaningful. The boy, in his innocence, never asked for anything in return. He never demanded rewards or recognition. When people called him a miracle, he only smiled shyly and said, "I just didn't give up." That simple truth became the foundation of the family's new life. The Tycoon, humbled by everything that had happened, changed too. Once known as a man of power and wealth, he was now remembered for his devotion and gratitude. He donated to hospitals, funded research for coma patients, and spoke often about the importance of love and faith. "Don't measure life in years or riches," he said in one speech. "Measure it in hope." Because hope is what keeps us alive. As seasons changed, the mansion filled with life again. Parties and gatherings returned, but they were no longer extravagant displays of wealth. Instead, they were celebrations of love, family, and the miracle that had brought them all together. Guests were welcomed warmly, the halls rang with laughter, and the woman who had once been lost in silence became the shining host once more. And through it all, Boy remained the quiet hero. He was still playful, still curious, still just a child, but he carried within him a wisdom beyond his years. To the Tycoon's wife, he was the son she never had. To the Tycoon, he was proof that miracles do not come from riches, but from hearts that refuse to stop believing. In the end, the tragedy that had once consumed them gave birth to a story greater than any wealth could buy, a story of faith, patience, love, and the extraordinary power of a child's pure heart. The mansion that had stood as a monument to sorrow was no longer a grave of memories. It had become a living testament to hope, and in its grand halls, laughter, music, and love once again found their home. The impossible had been done. A wife had returned to her husband. A boy had become a hero. And together, they had proven to the world that even after 20 years of silence, life could still begin anew.